Okay. Um, so as I was saying, I've been working on this for the past year and a half, and I started from zero. I really did not know where I wanted to go with the theme of foreign workers in the Japanese creative industries. But because we have the Game Research Center here at立命館, I thought it would be an interesting avenue. And it has proven to be quite fruitful, in my opinion. So my current working, ever-changing research question is, what is the relationship between Western video game developers and the Japanese video game industry? So you see that I specifically focus on Westerners. And the reason why will become apparent in a moment. My original hypothesis was that most Western developers came to Japan because they consume Japanese media, including video games. They created this version of imagined Japan in their lives that they wanted maybe to test by going to Japan or make it come to reality. And this hypothesis, it was based on my personal experience, as previously I had wanted not to work in the video games industry, but for a production company in Japan. So I started from where I was with the assumptions that I had, and I tried to probe in that direction. After doing some field work last year, including going to events and interviewing people, I have updated my hypothesis to one that is a lot more nuanced, which is that the situation is, of course, a lot more nuanced, but the relationship projected between projected soft power and the migration of Westerners is one element in the bigger puzzle. So I don't think my original hypothesis was completely off, but it's definitely not complete. Globalization, the stagnation of the video game industry in general, not just in Japan, and the deterioration of the middle-class lifestyle in North America and Europe also play a role. That is what I think right now, based on especially what I thought I discussed with the interviewees. And the hypothesis that this is an ecosystem where the Western expats and the industry itself help each other. Okay, so I have been trying for, I think, a year to decide which my chapters will be, and this is my first attempt. So these are three parts that I'm looking at in this presentation as well. The one is the theory itself of what it means to be indie. It was not part of my original plan, but after writing my article on the expat indie community in Japan, I realized that that theory itself is very important, not just to explain how Western immigrants live and interact with the Japanese locals in the society at large, but also to explain why there's an indie trend. These are some questions that I thought about. Some of them I explicitly address in the presentation, some not. The second part is the context itself, and not of the industry, but rather the Japanese society and the Japanese economy. And I will look at immigration stats as well. And the third part is the industry itself. And I think that's, I don't think that is where I will go the most in depth. Okay, so I start from the theoretical part, like I said in part one, because I think it's very important to understand what is happening in Japan. So Western scholars, when they discuss the indie community, they see it, or they used to see it, not homogeneous, but they thought it was possible to define it. And it's very difficult. The indie community, or the indie scene in general, is dependent on the technology that is available. It depends on the history of the country, and it depends on who defines it. Let me see. Okay. So what I mean by this, why is it contingent on the technology available? First of all, because let's say around the 1980s, when being indie became a thing and it became possible, which happened in the United States, the technology available to people at that time was a lot more limited. The distribution of the games themselves was physical, and there was the value put on the game itself was very different because not anyone could make it. It was a lot more laborious, and there weren't that many games, so they were a lot more valuable. Now, what the current situation, which is the situation that virtually all indie developers find themselves in, regardless of countries, that they're facing an oversaturated market, dominated by platforms, dominated by Play stores, and as we have seen, I'm sure most of you are aware, they are at the whims of whatever CEO is running Unity or Blender or whatever. I also say that it's dependent on the history of the country. And here I refer to two studies, one on the Brazilian indie scene and one on the Polish indie scene. Both articles make the case that because both the Polish market and the Brazilian market used to be closed off for a long time, their start was a lot later. So when they started out, whatever company popped out, no matter how big it was indie, because that's all there was. And I say it also depends on who defines it, because according to the same article on the Brazilian indie scene, the Pereira has found that developers and publishers and consumers do not agree on what makes a game independent. Developers tend to prioritize certain types of independence, while, for example, consumers consider a game is independent if the idea was originally of the developers and it was not imposed by a publisher, for example. On a theoretical level, scholars have tried to bring together a few types of independence that are important, and I feel like all of them together can kind of start to define it, but I think it's more of a toolbox to judge it rather than define what being indie means. So one article proposes that there are 3 levels of independence: financial, creative, and publishing independence. They also mentioned that it doesn't need that all 3 levels are met. Jesper Juhl proposes a financial. Okay, so we have the financial again, aesthetic and cultural levels must be met. And I think, I'm not sure, but I think he also mentions at one point that not all of them are always met. And there's a third one, which I focused a lot, and I think I still focus on it, political or ideological. In the early beginnings of scholars trying to figure out what indie meant, we had Lipkin, who is not very popular, I've seen in the studies, but I don't know, to me, it spoke to me. One idea that he had, first of all, to compare the independence in video games with the independence in other creative industries like music or films. And he came up with this idea that indie is also a form of anti-authoritarianism, which I have not seen quoted in other articles, so I think it did not resonate with many scholars. But Van der Hoef's study of the Polish industry, although it does not specifically put it the same way as Lipkin, he mentions that Polish studios avoid funding that comes from the government because of their communist past. So there's a distrust in the political class. So that's why I put them together, which I think is important. I think it's this political / ideological aspect does apply a bit to Japan. So my conclusion from this very short literature review, that to define what is indie really depends on the context. But then what is Japan as a context? So first of all, Japanese scholars insist that indie is a foreign import, which until I graduate, I will try to challenge. Developers also see it as a foreign import, but it makes me interested, the fact that it's foreign, what does it mean? And they say it's an import because Japan already had the doujin culture. Okay. So I tried to sketch out a very short list of differences between doujin and indies in terms of video games development, of course. So both of them, in terms of similarities, both of them are contingent on the available technology. It might be my research skills, but I have only found an article by Miyake that actually made a timeline of how doujin culture was born, expanded, grew, developed, and so on. And he shows that as that at first you had the Famicom, it was a new way for people to enjoy themselves. But it was very much a hobby-based culture. Nobody was thinking of making money off of it. And technically still nobody is if you're part of the doujin. Although things are changing, I think. He shows that when Windows was, as an operating system, was introduced in the 90s, that really affected the community itself. Developers had to, because developers were used to older, like different systems, then they got used to Windows, in short. And I think one thing that most scholars stress is that doujin culture is very much a physical culture. You have the game itself, you will share it on maybe, I don't know if a USB, I actually don't know enough about Comiket, but it's very much physical, whereas indie is not necessarily. It's not a monolithic culture that is fiadotau. He proposes that neither is monolithic, and it's very difficult to say because a game is like this, then it's doujin, or because a game is like this is indie. Both of them are agents for community building. Doujin has Comiket, and indies a lot of, honestly, holds monopoly on everything else. And they're both, at least originally, fueled by passion. In terms of differences, what most scholars and most developers agree on is that doujin creators are not profit-oriented, whereas indies are profit-oriented. I say stagnant versus ever-evolving. So I know that is a bit inflammatory, but that is my criticism to the idea that one is profit-oriented, one is not. As doujin culture and doujin games are defined right now, even though until now they have developed with technology and so on, there seems to be a point where scholars agree that if you cross into this next technology, it's not doujin anymore. Which is why I want to challenge this idea, because I think it can still grow. Another difference, one is PC culture, doujin is PC culture, and indies are defined as platform, that you find indie games on platforms, but that is right now, because it also used to be part of PC culture, of a very much a physical culture, but it moved away from that. Also, Dojin is Japanese versus indie seen as non-Japanese. Okay, so what is the context in which indies started becoming popular? This is from 2014. I think from around 2010 or 2009, there had been this feeling that Japanese games have started to stagnate, that it's not working anymore, that we need something new. And in 2014, I don't actually, I need to check if he's still the president of Sony Worldwide Studios, said people in Japan are very conservative in choosing where they work. So even if you are young and talented and have some great ideas to make games, when you say, I'm going to start my own company, parents will say, why are you doing this? Work for a great company. So the mentality in 2014 was that, no, you do not risk your career, your livelihood for a passion project, especially since until then, at least, a passion project is something you did in your own time, and then you went to your day job. So the general feeling was that Japan was behind. In 2018, a lot of articles about indies in Japan start popping up. At a big company, you're only one part of this big vision, a piece in a puzzle. It's opposite in indie development. You get to see your own ideas realized in a way you never could at a studio. That means that this quote refers specifically to the hierarchical system that exists in video game companies. But in 2018, 4 years later, you see that people start, or at least developers, the most outspoken developers, start challenging that. He says, I tend to visit universities and talk to programming students who are looking to go into game design. Joining a company like Nintendo has always been their end game. So the idea is challenged, but it's starting to be challenged, but not enough to actually change. Another developer says, the Japanese government has made some progress in letting people do more on the side, but there are plenty of people and companies that are hesitant to allow that. It might not happen as quickly as people hope. This quote is one reason why I challenge the idea that Dojin cannot grow further, because this is one hint at the fact that it's not just the culture, it was also the, let's say, legislative framework in which how you could work, what things you could do for money or not. It also says there have been plenty of things that have held back Japanese indie development. We don't really have a PC culture. Few of the developers speak English, making localization more challenging, and not a lot of people know about the indie world. A director of a big game company here didn't even know what PAX was until last year. So that would be 2017. I looked up on Google Trends a few terms. One is, it was actually recommended to me by Google itself, which was Switch Indie Game. And you can see that after 2016, you have a few spikes in searches on Google, but that is just for Switch indie games. So when Nintendo started introducing, when Nintendo introduced the opportunity for independent developers to publish their games on the platform. I don't remember exactly when that was. No, 2016, I think. Then I also looked up indies games. There have been a few spikes around 2010, and then a gradual increase since 2016. The same for indie. I don't know. I guess it's also because there's no agreed upon term on how we refer to indies in Japanese. Again, steady increase. Okay, this is not to be 100% representative, but it does show that the interest in indie comes after 2016. And why is that? So first of all, I think the CEOs of the companies realize that through indies, there are money to be made abroad. And I think all of you know what Shueisha is. Is there anyone who doesn't know Shueisha? Okay, great. Shueisha branches out in 2022 and becomes an indie publisher. And now we have Shueisha Games, which to me is incredibly fascinating. The head business administration and marketing, Michiharu Mori, says the following. From a strictly business standpoint, we want to be a profitable company so that Shueisha will continue to fund us and basically be able to get a larger share of global sales and not just be limited to Japan. The general problem was that Japan had started to make products only for inside of its market, which was impossible to export abroad because it was very, very market specific. He says we want to have really high quality games because you can't become, like I said, the Japanese developer without having critical recognition as well as commercial recognition. So there's the two main focuses. It's pretty generic, but I think if we can achieve one of those goals, then it makes the other one a lot easier. And on what differentiates Shueisha from its competitors, very established competitors, he says that what's going to differentiate us from some of the bigger publishers like Bandai Namco is that we're focused on smaller teams, smaller games, and with less restrictions. One of the things about using those big IPs that it's really difficult to do a lot of things. You have to get a lot of approval. If you haven't worked in Japan, you don't understand how approval is there's a lot of red tape. So Shueisha is trying to bypass the hierarchical system and to give smaller teams, smaller studios a voice. That's what they claim. I said before that one of the things that technically, one of the characteristics of indie games is that there's a political and ideological component to it. And I found it fascinating, the example of Poland, of developers being skeptical of accepting money from the government. Whereas in Japan, it's very different. This book, Indie Game Survival Guide, is published by this guy called Takaaki Chijo. And I see him currently as the spokesperson for the indie community, not just the Japanese indie community, but the indie community in Japan, because he works with both Japanese and Western developers. And I bought this book. Basically, it starts with a short introduction of what indie games are. And I found it very fascinating that although he declared that indie is a foreign import, in the book, he introduces a lot of graphs and shows the overlaps between indie and doujin. And he concludes that there's not much of a difference. They're not that different. I found that funny. But one thing, and I'll take his word for it because he's very involved, not only in the community, but also community building. He works with the government, he works with the companies. He says that in 2016 or 19, I'm sorry about that, I do not remember. It was the first time when a very young developer, I think it was Mini, was able for the first time to get their game published on Switch. And until then, this person had only published free games online and so on. And that was the first time. And he said that what his success showed was that we are entering an era when those who do the work can succeed, regardless of their career, technical skill, or age. So he refers to the fact that you don't need a hierarchy anymore. Finally, you can do what you want. He also worked with the Japanese government to help create a page a feature page on Steam that features indie games, and that has happened, I think, this year. So all things started rolling down this year, rolling down, the snowballing effect. The reason I see him as the spokesperson is because he is also the founder of IGI, Indie Game Incubator, which is the first and so far only game incubator in Japan. And they want to help those without experience on how to start a game from scratch, raise it, walk them through until publishing. And one of their sponsors is actually Shueisha Games. So I got very confused at this point. I thought, then how does independence from what, really, in the Japanese context? I will attempt to answer that a bit later. So we see that through indies, Shueisha, and also Nintendo, see an opportunity to get a footing again in foreign markets. But it so happens that their interests align with the interests of Western expats. So John Davis, who is global PR specialist at Shueisha Games, says, now you have various points of entry. People might like anime, so they go read the manga or vice versa. We want to get games into that loop as well. We want to have not just these existing IPs, but also new IPs that we can develop. Like Oni, and say, okay, yes, I love it. I read the manga. It's great. Maybe I'll make an anime about this. And we're just constantly feeding them into this Shueisha content ecosystem. I think it's really important. He also says that I think it's really important for publishers to have that personality and to have a strong brand identity, because it brings in people again. Of course, we want to support Japanese indies, but also indies around the world. I think it's not very clear why I say the interest of Westerners start to align with the company's interest, but I hope that will become clear a bit later. So down there, I say he's global PR specialist for Shueisha Games. Yes, he is. He's also co-founder of Bit Summit. I think most of you know what Bit Summit is, but I will introduce it later. Okay. Now I want to talk a little bit about the background for the Western foreigners themselves. Until now, I have talked about what it means to be indie, what it means in Japan, and what companies might find in this so-called trend. They do call it a trend. Now I want to look at the other half of my research, which is the Westerners themselves. So the debate around immigration in Japan has been long, and it's difficult because Japan considers itself a country with one ethnicity, or at least officially. But at the same time, it's facing low birth rates, an aging society, decreasing population, and a labor shortage. And there has been incremental opening since 2009, whether through tourist visas or through the introduction of the technical intern visas. What else? Those would be the main ones, I would say. As of 2022, there were 18 million foreign workers in Japan. 18 万. I wrote it down. Including part-time workers and technical interns. Most workers come from Asian countries, especially Vietnam, China, Nepal, and Indonesia. So we already see that Westerners themselves are a very small piece, but they seem to have a lot of influence in the indie area. Reasons why foreigners choose Japan. So the Immigration Bureau, I think I said Yes, a survey conducted for the Immigration Bureau on a sample of 40,000 residents with residence period longer than 1 year, combined with another survey conducted by Solmuso, shows the following. So I think I need to point at something. Yeah, I made the mistake of including all of them, but this one is the one we need to focus on, this pie chart. So we see that the biggest group is Chinese, with 26.8% of the total number of people who entered the country that year. Then we have Vietnamese, Filipino, Korean, Brazilian. Oh, thank you. Thank you. Oh, I like this. Okay, found it. Brazilian, then Indonesian, Nepalese, Taiwanese, and then we have a 2% Americans only. I know it says only 121, but again, 2%. And then the rest. That rest I consider to be both Australia and Europe, New Zealand, South Africa. So what this shows me is that there's an interest in how many Americans come to Japan, more than how many anything else. So it looks like they're interested in the big groups and also Americans. So they do, that tells me they do hold a special position in the eyes of the authorities. Okay. This is from 2016. So this is from 2022. How many people entered that year? Really? Okay. That explains the low numbers. And this is from 2016. And this is for reasons why you came to Japan. They were very happy to see that 19.4% came to Japan because they like Japan. Out of those 19.4, Americans account, where are they? 28%, which I found interesting. And now I realize that part is not relevant. Okay. So these ideas and this data I got from this article conducted by a think tank on how to work on the appeal of Japan, how to harness soft power to attract more foreign workers. And when they justified it, they were looking exactly at this graph. So there is an intersection between what people might want and the interests of at least the government itself. That is the graph they used. Okay, good. So I'm done with the boring part. My point was that there is Americans are at least 2%, and that at least officially the Japanese government is interested in this group. Okay, I hope that was convincing. Okay, so what role do Westerners actually play in the community? Now I will get into most of my field work, both physically and online. So what is their role? There's a study by Babar and Ohala from, sorry, it says 2012, it's actually 2022. That's a typo. So it's very recent. And they describe two ecosystems specifically in Kyoto. So their study is about Kyoto. Two ecosystems in the video game environment in Kyoto. One is the foreign one, and one is the Japanese one. And they say that the Japanese ecosystem is the one that brings in the money, while the foreign one doesn't circulate as much money, but it helps with internationalization because they bring people in. They are a connection to the outside world. The foreign-owned, F means foreign, the foreign-owned companies make ends meet by taking client work, not always related to game development. I also found that interesting because it seems like it's the case for many of them. They want to be video game companies. They are indie companies, but it's the big clients, they don't necessarily get big clients for video game development itself. And although it is called the foreigner ecosystem, in reality, it's formed mostly by Westerners, specifically North Americans and British citizens. Their employees tend to be from Western Europe, Australia, New Zealand, and North America, mostly. This is a small list of foreign-owned companies in Kyoto. Vitae, which is now defunct, Chuhai Labs, which is still out there, and it's actually trying to make its own games. Necologic, which actually doesn't have enough funds to make its own game, so it does mostly client work. Skeleton Crew, Denki Works, which is a very new one, Q Game, 17-bit, and I put there Robinson Technology, but it's just Seth Robinson, who's an independent and has been all his life, which is remarkable. And I found one in Osaka, which is Phoenix Games. For Tokyo, there are a few, but I have not gotten to them. Okay, so the indie events in Japan, in general, not just the foreign ones, there are grassroots events that started circa 2012 with Tokyo Indies and Kyoto Indies. Kyoto Indies is now defunct. Both events started as a response to the lack of communities that foreigners felt in Japan. Both events were emulated after North America events. So Tokyo Indies is emulated after Boston Indies in the US and Kyoto Indies after Mount Royal Society in Canada. And I know this for a fact. They have declared it and in interviews, and also I was able to meet some of the former organizers. And they are supported by public and private entities, the events themselves. Good. So the first event, I end with Bit Summit. So the first event, the big event, the first big indie game festival in Japan is actually Bit Summit. It started in 2013. Last year, they celebrated their 10th anniversary. We meet John Davis again, talking about in 2018 about Bit Summit when it started becoming more and more popular and more international. He says, a lot of foreign developers have a soft spot for Japanese gamers. Really, I think he meant games. David says, when asked about the global interest in Bit Summit, many of us grew up with games from Japanese companies played on Japanese consoles like Nintendo and PlayStation. There is a point of pride in being part of game shows in Japan and being covered by Japanese media like Famitsu. So this is my original hypothesis, spelled out by John Davis. So that showed me that I'm not necessarily off track. Okay, so what is the role of Bit Summit besides the fact that it's the first indie festival, it helps with internationalization? Well, James Milka, which is one of the other co-founders, he says, one thing we focus on is having our speakers be people that can help Japanese developers. Before our show, a lot of developers didn't know about Steam as a platform, Unreal or Unity as middleware, or Kickstarter as a crowdfunding platform. We exposed them to all that and put them in the same room with those people. Now, if you want to use Steam or want to get your game on a console, you can talk to representatives from Microsoft, Nintendo, Sony, or whoever you might need. He also says that the quality of Japanese indies has also increased during the 6-year lifetime of Bit Summit. We've seen a huge change in the last 6 years, with the quality and frequency of Japanese indie games making their way overseas. There's no way you'd see games like Ace of Seafood releasing outside of Japan before all this. So you can see that the co-founders kind of take credit for being the ones to introduce indie in Japan and for educating the Japanese developers. So I still take it with a grain of salt because I understand it's not meant to be patronizing, but to me, it still comes across as such. This is from last year's Bit Summit. You have local developers, overseas developers, and what I found interesting is that China has its own pavilion and Taipei has its own. It's not necessarily a pavilion, but it had its own corner. Game jams organized by Bit Summit. In 2023, it says Japan, Kyoto, Tokyo, Osaka, Okayama, Kagawa, China. So another claim or proof that it helps with internationalization. So that was it for Bit Summit, the first indie event, and it claims to have introduced essential elements of the indie community to Japan. Around the same time, when Tokyo Indies started, when Bit Summit started, Tokyo Indies also started. I attended only once because they tend to organize it in the middle of the month on a Wednesday, so that's very inconvenient for me. So I went once in June 2023. The location is at Club Mogra in Akihabara. And I think they made a point of setting the location in Akihabara. Held monthly since 2013 or 2012. I am off with my dates here. They offer English and Japanese support. And they have English and Japanese speaking crowds. It is pretty diverse. But as you can see, no other language. So you see the Western dominance there. And the participants, those who come are developers who show their works, PR people, artists, journalists, and including tourists, because now it has become a place where, you know, people who are game developers, they come for tourism in Japan and they're like, oh, I want to see how this indie scene is in Japan, and they come here. But it's interesting to say that when they Google indie events in Japan, they Google it in English and this comes up, so yeah. The organizer is Alvin Fu, who is very busy. I've been trying to meet him for a year and he always escapes me, and he has his own company now of VTubers. On the reasons why he started it. He says, I was attending events like Tokyo Game Show and my main engine for development, Unity. I'd attend some of their conferences, but I was thinking how Tokyo needs its own event where indies could just meet for drinks and talk, shop over some demos, do presentations, casually be able to meet up and talk. So you already see the things that he considers he introduced to Japan, being more casual, I guess. Next, I also went to Tokyo Game Show to see what that was about, and they have an indie corner. Journalists say that this has been the most fastuous Tokyo Game Show that ever happened. It rented the whole Makuhari Messe in Chiba. It was 9 pavilions. It took me 4 hours to find the indie corner. It was really small, but the indie corner was combined with the foreigner corner as well. So indie games from other countries, but not focused on individuals, but on the country representatives themselves. So that shows us that the mindset is that indie does not necessarily belong with the others. What is also interesting is that, as I said before, Alvin Fu, the organizer, he has his own company now, VTubers. He doesn't use English for it. He makes everything in Japanese. All his PR stuff is in Japanese. All his staff speaks Japanese. He was included in some of the, I think in the first pavilion, in the main pavilion. So you can see that the barrier is rather language than anything else. Those are my speculations right now. And China and South Korea had their own pavilions in the main hall. So they were not cooped up with the small foreigners from America and Europe and wherever else. They had their own. So it kind of shows, let's say, dynamics of power in the industry in Japan. Power or hierarchy. Good. And I tried to see what's still happening in Kyoto, because there used to be Kyoto indies in Kyoto. There used to be each pixel in Osaka. Both of them closed, either due to the pandemic, due to lack of interest and so on, but we still have Kyoto Playroom, and I went to see it. It's located close to Kyoto Tower in Hotel Anterun. There's no English support during the event, and only local Japanese indie developers participate, organized by Japanese developers only. They want to change that. They want to offer more English support. Sorry, I say participating, I mean presenting. You also have foreigners participating, but not necessarily presenting. But the problem is that when I talk to the organizers, they said they don't intend to be a indie event or an event where you come and showcase your games necessarily. They want to be an event for all types of media, but only if video games developer show up. Okay, so those are the events. Those are the places where they gather, because there was no community before. They wanted it. They emulated it based on what they had back home. So what do the people themselves say? Because I wanted to go even more in depth from an industry level, closer to the spaces themselves, and then to individuals who actually made the change and came here. So this is based on the interviews that I have taken since July last year. So I took semi-guided interviews between July 2023 and February 2024. I managed to get 12 participants who are based in Kyoto, Tokyo, and Kobe. Of course, everything is anonymized, as you can see here. And also, as you can see here, most are from North America. Now, I want to mention that for this study, I made it for an article specifically. I didn't only focus on foreigners, on Westerners, because I did find one interviewee who's from Latin America, and he was in the industry. He participated in events. So I switched my focus from Westerners to foreigners in general. Okay. My main focus for this article was the motivation before migration and opportunities and challenges in Japan. Because indies is such an elusive term, both individuals who work in video game companies or as freelancers and those who aspire to work in video games companies by participating in game jams, events, working on personal projects were included. So I didn't specifically only focus on those who work. Most of them do. Most of them are either freelancers or work for companies, but I do have two who sometimes work on personal projects, and I met them at game jam. So I thought, okay, I will include you. Some of the themes that came up were self-fulfillment, and I'll explain it a bit later, disappointments, filling in the gaps, which I talked about before, the community, and the challenges. So those are the themes that I worked with. Okay, in terms of self-fulfillment, I have a few representative quotes. One interviewee says, there are a lot of things in Japanese culture that I vibe with. It's hard to pinpoint. I was particularly interested in everyday life in Japan. And I always wanted to live in Japan to get the right insight, because I always wanted to know if my fascination with Japan was based on the real thing, or whether I was just living in Europe, having this fantasy of this country. But if I never go there to see it, it's just a fantasy. So self-fulfillment here refers specifically to my original hypothesis, which is I consumed Japanese media, I loved it, it inspired me to start my career, but I also want to see the thing that I built up in my head. We have another one that has very similar reasons, but they are more technical. I have always had an intense love for Japanese creators, specifically games made within Japan under big labels like Nintendo, Sega, Capcom, as well as writers and directors from Japan, mostly like anime and manga stuff, but also regular movie directors. I wanted the same sort of perspective, like a lot of the artists that I admired. I wanted to see the life they lived firsthand and see if I can find myself in the biggest gaming industry in the world. There's another one who says, I played video games since I was super young, so I'm kind of a massive video game like nerd. I thought it'd be really cool to work with the creators who make the games I really like. I just really like their artistic vision. There are some who didn't come because they love Japan and they wanted to see how it is. There are those who just came for familial reasons. But most of them didn't come permanently, but they stayed. Especially North Americans say, we agreed to come here. This is only one person, but the perspective that it's a life upgrade is shared amongst them. One such person says, we agreed to come here for 2 years, and over time I started to enjoy the Wagyu, you know? I guess the low crime and how it's kind of comfortable. You can walk around at night and like it's different from where I'm from. I did find it fascinating that 2 men told me, you know, if women can walk alone at night, then I feel like I can do that too. Then another one who is a lot younger. This one started his career during a time when the market was not oversaturated. This one started a lot later. And he says, another thing that attracted me to Japan was it was kind of basic, but the cost of living here is a lot more reasonable than where most of game companies are in America, at least. He did mention at one point that it got so bad for him, he used the words, I got priced out of living in my hometown. I couldn't keep doing what I was doing because it was too expensive. I couldn't pay rent. Of course, there were disappointments, which I found fascinating because I think they are very sharp. They're very critical. I think despite fulfilling this long dream that they built in their youth, they were disappointed to realize that time had passed and indeed Japan had changed. And I included this one quote, which I found fascinating. I feel like you could find this perspective a lot, especially online. He says, I first thought it was this amazing place with so many events and so much beauty and scenery. There are parts that are beautiful, but there are also parts that are disappointing. Like within technology, you can go to a ramen shop and you can use the little vending machine that pulls out a ticket. And like 30 years ago, that was the coolest thing in the world. But in the modern era, it's not that cool anymore. I love the use of the word modern era. The older respondents whose impression was shaped by images of the futuristic technological advancement of the 1990s also expressed disappointment in the technical skill level of their Japanese colleagues compared to their home countries. I take all of this with a grain of salt, but they were very sharp about this. And one of them, who was, in my opinion, a lot more balanced, he said that some, when referring to development, video game development, go as far as to say that in Japan, systems of hierarchy hinder development. While most Japanese developers seem reluctant to go outside the box they have put themselves in or learn why things are the way they are. The same respondent explained that this reluctance for change gives foreign developers an advantage because they can complete projects that local teams struggle with. Again, I wouldn't take that at face value, but it's interesting that that is the perspective. In terms of the indie community, they were shocked that there was no indie community when they arrived at the beginning of the 2010s, which is why they started these events. This one respondent says, in the beginning, we would have games about the events. In the beginning, we would have games running in the background just to get people talking with each other. There was formal presentation time where each presentation could be up to 5 minutes. I wanted to keep it really short. I didn't have the PowerPoint slides. Ideally, we would have live demos. It didn't matter how bad or how ugly the game was. The important thing was that it was working. He says that didn't happen before and that people didn't necessarily understand how to do that in 2000 something. In terms of main points of entry to Japan, only one of them applied to the Shinsotsu system. 3 of them got to Japan to be with their families through marriage. 2 through personal network in Japan. 2 company transfers. 1 is an English teacher. 1 came through a foreign-owned company in Japan. Language school, and 1 that is unknown. And my observation was that all of those who work in the industry had work experience prior to coming to Japan. So if those who live in Japan and work in a Japanese company right now had previous experience. Those who did not have previous experience, so they have a degree, but they do not have experience working in a company or a special skill that Japanese graduates don't have, struggle to find employment in Japanese companies. And one person, which I did not interview, but I have come across this person many times at different events, across 8 months, this person had been trying to find a job. But because the skills they were putting forward were very easy to come by in Japan, everyone had that. In 8 months, this person was not able to secure a job. Where they work. So where they work now, because not all of them stayed with the original companies. 3 work for a Japanese company, 2 work for a foreign-owned company, 6 are self-employed, and 1 for a public school. Most respondents expressed their dislike of the Japanese work style, which is why they decided to either work as freelancers or for a foreign-owned company, where the environment was familiar and less hierarchical. And one of them quit the foreign-owned company due to personal differences. Those who work for Japanese companies do so mainly because they need visa sponsorship. This is specifically related to this sample. And according to them, in their cases, unique skills were a requirement in finding a job. Okay. When asked about the community itself, they talk about a shared sense of belonging in the indie community, in the imagined indie community. They do relate to the Japanese developers in terms of the struggle of getting your game funded, published, and so on. And they describe the community as being very universal. Everywhere you go in the world, you walk in there, you know exactly what it is. They say when you're at Bit Summit or if you're at Tokyo Indies, you enter the space and you immediately know how to communicate. And it's so easy to make connections. At Bit Summit, there's people from all over the world and you can immediately talk to anyone because we're all game people. It's such a shared thing. That's also why I'm in the industry, because it's so comfortable. Both the people I interviewed and the organizers of Bit Summit claimed to have introduced new ways of video game production to Japan, and a new type of community, I might add. The contributions they claim to have introduced are using platforms, using crowdfunding services, using Unity or Unreal Engine, doing so-called post-mortems, which is pulling up your game after you released it and talking about what went wrong, what went well, what you could have done better. So they claim it's probably them who introduced that to Japan, that they weren't doing that before. Doing presentations of one's own projects to a larger crowd and getting feedback, the community itself, and the indie mindset, making money off of one's passion project. To go back to Dojin and why I am very on the fence of the differences and so on. Making money off of one's passion project. There are Dojin creators who were popular enough that they did manage to do that. But I found it very interesting. One of the articles, Hichibe, he explains, well, once you do that, you're not Dojin anymore. Okay, the struggles in the community. There's a language barrier that is prevalent. There are different approaches to collaboration, but there is hope for overcoming those barriers as long as one of the sides can communicate. Like there's someone who needs to have two languages. One interviewee says people are kind of sticking within their own like nationality or like, you know, culture. If someone doesn't speak any Japanese, then it's more likely that they're only going to be mostly talking to people who speak English. I think there's some kind of cultural language kind of reasons why some people try to stick in their own groups, but other people don't. If they're bilingual, they'll be speaking to everyone, but it really varies. And that is an opinion I found. In my personal experience doing field work, participant observation, and talking to people, the developers who only speak Japanese, they're actually very happy to talk to you if you understand them. Okay, so I am almost done. Going back to my current research question, what is the relationship between Western video game developers and the Japanese industry? Westerners fill the knowledge and technological gap in Japan by emulating home environments. There is a degree of separation between the Westerners and the Japanese, enforced by the language barriers and the conception that indie is a foreign element. I do think that this idea that indie is a foreign element does draw a line between us and them. I had an ill attempt at a joke, scratching each other's backs. It's a new heaven for Western indies. You know, in a society where you're not priced out of living in your hometown and you can't be fired at will. And it's also a gateway for Japanese companies to Western markets. Some conclusions. The concept of indie in Japan seems to be related to the ability of small-scale productions to become profitable rather than aesthetic, cultural, financial. So in terms of, in the Japanese context, what does it mean to be indie? Just the fact that you can make your own, you can release your own public project, even if it's supported by a big publisher, even if it's not the most aesthetically independent, the fact that you can do that, that's a new thing in Japan. There's a strong emphasis on community building from the developers themselves and Shueisha as well, because one of their main goals, they say, is to foster the growth of this community. There's a strong emphasis on cross-border collaboration, but there is little focus on cross-cultural integration. Okay, this is a bit long, but I don't think I would have been able to remember it, so I just wrote it down. So this is my current working hypothesis. I have a sense that through Western foreign residents, Japanese companies can keep their business models while tapping into new markets and practices without being interfered with by foreign elements. The Westerners and the Japanese companies work in collaboration, and neither has to change. At the same time, they can fall back on neoliberal practices by promoting indies as a desirable career choice. Oyama Shinji published this article last December he argues on the creativity of Shueisha editors. He discusses this practice in Shueisha of retaining a core staff of publishers. Typical Shueisha would be editors of manga. Here, publishers. So retaining a core staff of by retaining a core staff of publishers, Shueisha is able to maintain its business model of the lifetime employment, great benefits, and so on, and still produce best-selling hits by, to an extent, supporting those who make the original works, but not investing that much into them. For video games, this is a new thing because video game developers were always part of the company. They were never independent before, like a manga artist is. Normally, working on your own project was reserved as a dojin hobby. Now, with a weaker yen and a weaker economy, less people can be hired permanently. I say now, but since the 90s, which challenges the status quo of Japan as a country with lifetime work stability. Indie comes as a holy grail that offers more options to both individuals and companies. Although so far it seems to me that companies, i.e. the publishers, are the winners, while the individuals, yes, they gain freedom, but in an oversaturated market. And this would be my bibliography here.